Welcome to the Inside Housing Podcast, where we break down the housing process, real estate, and investing. Here we go. Megan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you could make the drive up and really excited to dive into some really interesting topics today. So can you start off by introducing yourself?
Sure.
Who you are, what you do, and what's your role at the Vermont Chamber of Commerce?
So my name is Megan Sullivan. I am the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vermont Chamber of Commerce, which means I head up our advocacy team, our work in the State House, our mission of advancing Vermont's economy, working with our members to say, what is it going to mean for you to achieve that? And then bringing that to the work in the State House, the legislature, trying to advance policy that works for Vermont business and try and shape and curtail some policy ideas that really don't work for that mission of our economy.
Okay. And how did you get to this role?
It was quite a journey. I was one of those lucky ones who went to UVM for political science and then immediately got a job working for the Department of Economic Development as a business liaison, which brought in the political science, working for an administration and really introducing me to the business world. I grew up with two business owners as parents, so it was something I was familiar with and became passionate about through that job. From there, I got the opportunity to become the business liaison in Congressman Peter Welch's office, now Senator. I spent the next 6.5 years really looking at how policy impacts businesses. Being in Vermont, it meant I was working with those businesses directly, hearing their stories, hearing their needs, and really understanding that sort of policy to personal reality. From there, I got the opportunity to work for the Scott administration running Vermont's Economic Progress Council, which oversees a business incentive program and the tax increment financing program. And so that was an interesting opportunity to say, all right, you've seen how policy gets made. Working for Congress, that's a little dysfunctional, but going from how policy gets made to then what does implementation look like and where can things really help and hinder in that implementation process? What does an application look like? What does the reporting look like? And then when this job became available or created really with the Vermont Chamber, it was the best of both worlds. Working on policy, but at the state level where so much more is happening, getting done that really impacts our community, with the understanding of what implementation looks like. I think that's really helped our success bringing those worlds together in the last few years.
Now, the first time I met you was you were doing a presentation for VAR and Kevin Chu was there. Mm-hmm. And so we got a look inside where is Vermont currently, right? From a data perspective with Kevin. And it was interesting because as he's talking about it, I mean, you know him well, the numbers are not looking good for Vermont. And I don't think there's any Vermonters right now that can escape that anymore. Whereas I think maybe there was a couple of years where we could maybe think that things were okay. And so as it connects to housing and as it connects to policy, where are you seeing things from your position right now?
I think in the last biennium, the last 2 years in the legislature, I think there are more and more legislators who are seeing that, who are feeling it, right? Certainly the outcome from our last election, people took as a message to say we really need to focus on the problems that are affecting everyday Vermonters, not these big policy agendas that are maybe being driven by outside national agendas and not really what's right for Vermonters. And I think things like housing became really front and center for folks to say we have to do more to solve the problems. We keep spending more money and it's not changing the course of where we're at. So spending money is not the solution. We need to address some of our root causes. Housing is a huge piece of that. Now, it's all cyclical. Our healthcare system is very expensive. Part of the reason it's expensive is because we don't have enough providers. We don't have enough nurses. We have to pay for traveling nurses. And that scarcity of workforce drives up the cost. The cost of healthcare is driving up the cost of education. The cost of education is driving up the cost of property taxes, which is driving up the cost of housing. And this all becomes really interconnected. What I love about Kevin is that he can take this sort of spiral that I go on of, everything's interconnected. How do we solve everything? And just brings it back to the data and brings it back to the idea that data is not destiny and that we can approach these things. We can take these big problems and break it down into the data to figure out how do we move forward.
So last year in the legislature, there was a lot of talk around
I think there were really important parts of Act 181, and that's why we were really adamant that there were some calls to repeal all of Act 181. The exemptions, the tier 1 area exemptions, are really critically important to say if we're going to, as a state, say there are areas where we want to grow in our downtowns and our village centers, we need to get out of the way. We need to say it's okay to grow here. And that if you want to put in 40 units, that's where we want it. We're not going to say no and say, okay, you can do 9 units here and then you can do 9 units 5 miles down the road. But to say, how do we incentivize growth? Those interim exemptions that came out of Act 181 with the intention for longer term exemptions were really important to get one of the barriers out of the way. I think what happened in that compromise of saying, okay, if there are areas where we're saying this is where we really want to incentivize growth, are there areas of the state where, because Act 250 is based on the size of the development, not the location of the development, are there critical natural resources of statewide importance that we need to be protecting? Where I think things went off the rails is you've asked a group of regulators to say, should things be regulated and by who? And the expectation that it's not yes and us is where we saw a huge problem.
So when you say regulators, who are you referring to?
The Land Use Review Board.
Okay. And they are a nonpartisan, non-elected board?
They're who oversee Act 250. They were created through Act 181 and then had a long list of tasks, including figuring out where they were going to approve Tier 1 areas, implementing a road rule in Tier 2, and looking at Tier 3. I would say one of the things that was not assigned to them was creating maps for Tier 3. But again, you've said, here's a group of lawyers and planners. We want you to go to the public and say, should these things be regulated? How are they already being regulated? Where should they be regulated and how? And they skipped that step and said, let's start with the maps. Instead of ending with, let's get all the details, let's get this all figured out, and then see what a map looks like. It said, let's do the maps first. Take those to people, see what they think. The results were people were outraged. Rightly, the maps were scary.
As you're describing it, right, and when I'm having conversations with people and you're trying to understand, like, okay, you got 181 and you got 250 and you got these maps, and it just seems so confusing. And in researching today, I came up with this thing and it kind of said how we got here with land use. And so we had Act 250 come out in 1970, and then the Home Act 2023, Act 81 2024, 2025 was then the S127 to chip, and then now we're at S325. That seems like a lot of different regulations kind of put on top. And if the core issue is we know we need to make it easier to make more housing, is it just like chipping away at it? From your standpoint at the chamber, what should we be doing?
I think there's a lot that we need to do. And I think part of it is we have to step back, look big picture. What are we regulating and how? And what we hear a lot of is there's so much duplication, right? We talk a lot about Act 250. And when developers talk about permitting, a lot of it comes to Act 250. And part of that is because Act 250 is the last step and everything can be thrown off from it, right? Someone appeals your Act 250 permit and you're sunk. But there's so much that happens before Act 250, so many local permitting hoops that you have to jump through, so many hoops through Agency of Natural Resources that you have to jump through, that the $200,000 that you spend on Act 250 plus all of the engineering costs that go into preparing for that are just a small portion of everything that you've had to do leading up to that. I really think there was a bill that passed last year with great work by the Realtors Organization and Peter Tucker that gave me hope. And that was S212, which was about water connections. Pretty small bill, but recognizing that if you're doing a water hookup in a downtown, why do you need the municipality to sign off and the state to sign off? That's a duplication of money. That's a duplication of efforts. And I think the legislature realizing that's unnecessary, a waste of time and money, is a really good thing. And I think we need to build on that. So instead of just going in and saying there's duplication everywhere, the systems are broken, Let's get really specific. What are those duplicative processes? What I would love to see is, instead of a place of saying, okay, duplication is acceptable, and then we'll figure out where maybe it's not working, is to say as a state, duplication is not acceptable. You cannot ask the same project to go to multiple places for a wastewater permit, for stormwater permits, to look at the same thing over and over again. Everybody gets a chunk of money to do it, and it takes time and multiple cracks at the sort of engineering of it to say the start is you cannot duplicate what you ask someone to do. And now state and municipality, figure it out. But as a state, we're saying duplication is not allowable.
And so when you refer to duplication, are you talking about having one set of state regulations and then municipals have their own regulations?
We're saying, okay, when it comes to regulating wastewater, there may be some municipalities that say, I'm too small for that. I need the state to do that. The state has to be ready to help those municipalities oversee wastewater. And if there are larger communities that say, you know what, we do this, we have the staff to do it, the state can say, all right, we see you have staff that can do it. We're going to trust you to do it. There seems to be this lack of trust between the state and municipalities of saying, I know the state signed off, but I want our folks to sign off. And even between the Act 250 Commission and the Agency of Natural Resources of saying, I know you looked at this, but we want to look at this. These are engineers, professional engineers, both working at the state and working with the developer. We need to start trusting each other in order to make progress.
And then how's the chamber and yourself? What are the things that you're kind of pushing for and also looking for so we're in an election cycle and politics has to play a role. What are you seeing in terms of, is it just specific items? Is it more like policy? Which things are you kind of focused on?
I think we're going to continue to focus on those areas of how do we get to the root causes of our problems and how do we address them, right? Just throwing money at issues is not solving our problems. We can see that from how much money we spent with the dollars we got from the federal government during COVID that have not made homelessness in Vermont better, has not created a level of housing that meets the demand that we have. So saying, what are those problems? What are people actually saying? Stop treating developers like the enemy. If you're not a nonprofit developer, there are a lot of people in the State House who, I think our former lieutenant governor called them profiteers if you're a for-profit developer. The majority of our housing needs to come from for-profit developers. There's nothing wrong with making a profit. We live in America. It's a part of what we do. And just because you're a nonprofit, it doesn't mean you're not making money. You just call it revenue instead of profit.
To a degree.
For
and
sure.
I always wonder, like, how can we need businesses, right? And producing housing is a business. So,
absolutely. And those businesses pay a lot of taxes, which help provide the services to our most vulnerable citizens.
So why are we bogging ourselves down, like from your sort of seat?
One issue, if I had that magic wand, and I would love for this to become an issue for the speaker in the pro tem race and as many people as I need to say this to, is right now we have housing committees in the House and the Senate, and then we have land use committees. And there is very territorial actions in jurisdiction of the housing committees who say, we have to talk about land use. Land use is a huge challenge in housing.
Yeah, how can you talk about those separately?
They are forced to be talked about separately because the committees who have jurisdiction over land use are saying, that's not your jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction is land use, and you won't understand the environmental impacts. And the housing committee is saying, you don't understand the housing impacts. It has become so dysfunctional that these conversations can't happen together. I would love to see in our next leadership in the State House an acknowledgement that we have to break down those barriers and there needs to be some level of joint jurisdiction when it comes to land use and housing if we're going to make real progress there, if we're going to really understand the problems.
I sometimes try to boil it down to the simplest way of thinking about it for somebody who's listening who just can't wrap their minds around the different acts and regulations, all that. Everyone says we want to build more houses and we want to have more homes. But then when you go to do it, especially as you expand outside like Chittenden County kind of areas, there's all this red tape. And you're saying that land use and housing committees that look over that are not talking to each other? or having the conversation together?
They're not having that conversation together. And so right now our housing committees generally are supposed to talk about programs, funding, and our land use committee talks about land use. But there are really important voices in the housing community that have the most experience with housing and land use that aren't being heard. And you have a lot of frustration in the committee saying, we're working on housing, we have to talk about land use, that aren't getting that opportunity and feeling like when they get a bill that has housing and land use aspects, they're only allowed to talk about sort of that, again, programming. So things like the missing middle housing development program. They're talking about programs like that, about all of our affordable subsidized housing programs, funding for those programs. But they're not talking about what are the impediments to getting housing built in terms of other land use policies.
And is that because that's how it's set up?
Because that's how it's set up. And there's been challenges to that, but so far it's been really stuck.
So that's an issue that you'd like to see brought up.
Yeah, and it has to happen at that leadership level. It has to be a decision that the speaker and the pro tem make to say, okay, we've made some progress on housing, right? We're chipping away at it. But if we want to keep digging in and understanding it, we've got to break down these silos. And part of it is that jurisdiction, but there's so much more to it, right? Our housing is not just going to be solved with changes to land use. We have major workforce problems, right? You can't find people to build housing in Vermont. So we've got to bring in our commerce department to talk about what are we doing about our workforce? Why are we, if we've got something like 11% of Vermont's 16 to 24-year-olds aren't working and they're not in school. What are they doing? Construction seems like a great opportunity. How do we get them to take over our electrician jobs when we have people aging out of that workforce, our plumbing jobs? How do we get those general contractors with that next level of workforce? What are our transportation committees doing to say, are our transportation systems supporting the housing that we need? Everyone needs to come to the table. Every committee needs to come to the table on this.
So as you're saying that, I'm thinking to myself, you scroll on social media, you watch the news, every conversation right now is about housing, and every person running for some sort of office, regardless of party, is saying, yes, we all agree we need this. So then where are the differences that filter down? If we all know we need it, why don't we just do it? You're looking at it from a nonpartisan lens at the chamber. So why isn't it just we sit around and...
I think because there's a lot of different priorities, right? You and I hear a lot about housing, but then when you get into the State House, there are advocates for 50 other things who are saying, I want people's attention on this issue. I want people's attention on this issue. And frankly, money in politics plays a role. Who are some of the biggest spenders in our Vermont's political campaigns? There's a lot of spending that happens from some of our organizations who really push for conservation.
Like environmental?
I'm going to say conservation. Because for me, environmental, when I look at the project the O'Brien brothers are doing in South Burlington, that's net zero, that's density, that is an environmental project. That's more environmental to me than what goes on in my community where we say, instead of building 10 houses on 30 acres, you can build those 10 houses on 3 acres, and then you're going to conserve the rest of it. That's a growth area. Instead of saying conserve the rest of it, say, then you're going to build even more densely. That's our goal, is to say, all right, instead of 10 houses, we want to see 20 houses. And some of those are going to be for income ranges below what Jericho, where I live, is currently building. So I think that conservation movement and an environmental movement are not the same thing.
Because you drive, for anybody who lives in Vermont, you drive through Vermont, we have so much open space. The conservation sort of, the group that is pushing for that, is it just to keep the expansion sort of limited to certain areas? Or is it to really just keep our footprint intact the way that it is and find other ways to grow?
I don't want to speak for somebody else. And there are certain conservation groups that I had very strong opinions about. And then as I worked with them, okay, you know what? We can find common ground to move forward with. They're very concerned about flooding and what are the impacts from climate change and how are we building in a smart way. And if you have a driveway or multiple driveways that go up of a side of a hill that then create erosion and create problems downstream for those communities, are we thinking through that when we're looking at building? Are we really thinking that through? And can our land use policies and our land use regulators be more empathetic in that way and not just say, we're going to start with no, but saying, all right, let's look at this. Let's see if there are any of these impacts, challenges. What if we move the driveway this way to the left or this way to the right? That could change the scope. Or if when you build this, you put in some certain type of greenery that'll help absorb challenges if it floods. That to me is how regulation should be. Start with yes, and then say, how do we adjust? And I think some of our conservation groups would agree with that. I think there are some folks who are just like, I don't want things to change. I've got my piece of heaven. And so anyone else who has it somehow takes away from me, right? It's a zero-sum game.
That kind of reminds me of when Kevin was talking about the housing data, and he asked a question and they polled Vermonters, and it said, do you think we should have more housing? And it was like 60% said yes. And then it's, do you think we should have more housing in your town? And then it drops to like 50 something. And then it's, do you think we should have more housing in your neighborhood? And it's 40%. And so is that kind of where that's coming from, you think?
I think so. And I live that, right? I live in a community that is notorious for creating policies that slow housing progress. I live in Jericho. And I think the average cost of a new house that was built in Jericho, so not the average cost of any house that was sold, but just the new house was about $9 last year. We're only building for these sort of high-end housing units, and it's 9 5-bedroom housing units, 9 to avoid Act 250, and saying we can't build units, which is great. I welcome those homes in our community, but we also need let's put in 20 townhouses. Just the same number of bedrooms, should be able to have the same level of wastewater, sewer infrastructure, but the community says, oh, we can't support that. We can't do that. So for most of our town, it's illegal to build condos. It is illegal. And so I got a call one day saying, I love what you're saying about housing in the state. What are you doing about housing in our community where most of the people in our town would have signs outside that say, in our house, we support everybody. We're a very progressive town. I think if you looked at voting records in Jericho, it's very progressive. But we have put so many barriers in place to build housing, to accept people who are different from us. If you can't afford that level of house, you can't afford to live in Jericho. And I think that takes some real soul searching to say, okay, how can I put this placard on my front yard saying, in this house we believe, but then also accept that our town policies say we don't actually want anyone who's different from us here.
What you're saying earlier, this double regulation, right?
Yeah.
Where the state has certain things, even if the state said no regulation for all these things, towns and municipalities still have their own. So what then is on the state to try to do, knowing that we're going to have those issues?
Yeah, I think the state has done a lot of work on carrots, right? We have grants, municipal grants to help towns revisit some of their policies, to rethink that. And there's been some sticks, like duplexing by right. Towns can't say you can't add an ADU, you can't have a duplex. But something I suggested last session that's getting studied is for my community, and I think for a lot of communities in Vermont, there are other restrictions, right? My homeowners association says you can't build an ADU. There are deed restrictions in a significant portion of our town that says you can't build an ADU. So we've identified growth areas, and within those growth areas are large swaths of land that say nothing else can be built here. And I think the state, as we've put out programs, as we've created CHIP, saying we're going to help you build infrastructure to support our statewide goal of housing. If you're a community that wants to accept money for transportation infrastructure for your small underused school, that you should have some ownership of saying, we're going to take state money and we're going to help the state meet its priorities of housing. We're not going to at least be an impediment to that. And if you are an impediment, that should come at a cost of, is the state going to be giving that much money to a community that is saying no to housing? So we need the stick. We also need the carrot.
So that's really where it's coming in. Because I think I would agree to a certain extent. I serve on a school board. So the idea of local control to extent I think is important most Vermonters. But then you're really looking at the state as saying, are we having the right incentives or sort of repercussions for being able to promote and help with housing?
I think that doesn't get rid of local control. So if a community wants to vote down, as we saw last year, an affordable housing project, which would have brought more families into that community, but also said, listen, our school is old, it needs fixing, it is vastly underpopulated by kids, saying, if you're not going to accept new housing, you can't then also ask us for money to help with your school. Then as a community, your control is saying, we don't want this, so we're going to fix this problem for ourselves.
The Chamber of Commerce, like, it's a business, it's for business promotion. So this is slightly offbeat from housing, but as far as like being friendly to businesses, how would you say Vermont ranks right now?
I would say we have opportunity to grow. We did our business climate survey last year. It's an annual survey, and our responses rated Vermont's business friendliest at about a 2.6 out of 5. So, it's okay. It's not great. I think what's also concerning is in our competitiveness dashboard, and the Futures Project has published, we rank 51st for economic momentum. So there's 50 states. Somehow we're 51st. It's because Washington, D.C. is involved. But that's bad.
That means that we're first?
Yeah, that's last.
Okay.
So we have nowhere to go but up. But that is future looking. What's our momentum? So we're at a 2.6 now. Are we trending in the right direction? That competitiveness dashboard would say our economic momentum is not good. I think a few reasons. One is our demographic challenges, right? We are not bringing people into the state, and we are not creating people in the state. We're the only state in the nation last year that lost population by both natural growth, more people being born than dying, or immigrating into the state. Not good. So we need housing in order to change that. In order for more people to move in here, we have to have housing for them. In order to build the housing, we need more people. So we've got to come up with some creative solutions there. And I think they exist.
What makes us not having that momentum, though?
Part of it is you look at, okay, what is your workforce going to look like? What's the momentum? Are you going to be able to grow jobs? If we have 17,000 people retiring every year, 5,000 graduating seniors, and we don't have people moving in, we're not going to be able to fill those jobs. It's going to be harder and harder to retain businesses that need to grow here. And so that's part of it. Certainly our cost of living and that regulatory system we've talked about in housing, it exists for businesses as well. If you have a business in the state, what are the regulations you need to go through? We have a high tax burden on our businesses to be here. We have a lot of regulation around how you operate, how you employ people. It's really challenging. And then if you look at our cost of healthcare. So when I hear some groups saying wages in Vermont are so low, we have the highest healthcare costs in the nation. So an employer who might say, I would love to give this person a raise, but our healthcare premiums are going up 20% this year. So that's where their raise went. It can't just be about let's increase the minimum wage and that will grow wages and that'll grow economic opportunity. We're not looking at the root causes of our problems.
And so as you see it, the root cause, if you had to just lay it out, is?
I don't think there's one, right? I wish we had the silver bullet to say, if we solve this one thing, we'll figure it out. But I think where the economic action plan focuses, people and places. So our root causes are about places for people to live and people to come be participants in our workforce, be participants in our civic life, fill jobs, and create that sort of economic momentum that we're going to need to thrive.
Would you say that the climate then in Montpelier, that everybody understands this?
No.
How can they not? And maybe I feel like I don't live in a bubble, even though I'm connected to real estate. I have agents that sell and buy and just living. But I feel like everybody's talking about this. So you're saying it's not a consensus that we need more people here and we need more homes?
I think there's some consensus around needing more homes. But there's also the question of, okay, what type of homes? Some people would like to say all of our homes that we need are income restricted housing. That's what we need to focus on is income restricted housing. That's all. And that's not meeting the moment, right?
Wow.
That doesn't create housing for our seniors that have worked hard and want to maintain a certain quality of life and want to stay in Vermont, maybe not in their 5-bedroom house, but they need housing that's acceptable for them. And it's probably not going to be in an income restricted unit. It's going to be in a smaller housing unit in the neighborhood they grew up in or in the community that they love. And we're not building those units. We're not building the places where if you are in an income restricted unit and you get that promotion, you can't stay in that income restricted unit anymore, but you also can't afford a $600,000 single family home. But we're not creating an environment where those in between middle income, missing middle homes can be built.
So I can tell you from experience in real, anytime there's a house that is somewhere between 3 and 450 in that ballpark, 2-3 bedroom, single family home, usually multiple offers. There's just such a demand for that kind of home. And to me, it kind of speaks to also what Vermont is for the most part, which is land, space, the outdoors, and then kind of like the American dream, right? My own little home. And it's huge demand. And everything outside of that becomes a bit more niche. So you're saying that's not a consensus? Not everybody understands that we need a couple 100,000 more single family homes?
Absolutely not. That is not a consensus at all.
Is that a political thing?
I'm sure there's some politics involved. I'm sure there's some personality involved in that. There was one senator a couple of years ago who said, I drove around my district. There's lots of houses. I don't think we have a housing crisis. Mind blowing. I'm hearing there's all sorts of that feel versus data can be really challenging to overcome. And again, we worked with this organization who supported our campaigns, and they said our real priority needs to be climate change. We are a tiny state. How can we most help deal with climate change, in my view, is how do we incentivize housing near jobs and transportation systems that work. It's not going to be by saying we should ban data centers, then Vermont will be a leader in climate change. Probably not. Probably not. We can certainly regulate things, but if we actually want to create a climate forward policy, it should include a lot of different types of housing.
So as we kind of turn, we're in the middle of campaigning, election season. Yeah. There's a lot going on. What are some things that you're looking at as the legislator is set? Because there's a lot of movement right now, if I understand. Mm-hmm. So what, from your seat, what are you looking at and keeping an eye on?
So the speaker isn't returning. The pro tem of the Senate isn't returning. So we'll have brand new leadership, both in the House and the Senate. And then we also have a lot of change in our chairs. And the chairs set the agenda, right? We're going to have a new chair of Commerce and Economic Development. We're going to have a new chair of the Environment Committee. That change in chairs can really change the priorities in what a committee is talking about. And the change in the leadership can change how a leader oversees their committees, how much pressure they put on chairs to take certain things up. I think the leadership that we've had has been really trusting of their chairs to say, you set your agenda, we'll check in, but less of that pressure of saying, okay, housing is their number one priority. I want to hear what every chair is going to be doing to address housing in some way. And what are you doing in education on housing? Because there's an educational component of saying, are we doing enough to put people into CTE programs? Are we fixing our CTE programs? What are you doing in the Commerce Committee on workforce and housing? What are you doing in the Housing Committee? What are you doing in the Environment Committee? What are you doing in the Transportation and in the Taxing Committee? Tell me what they're doing. Human Services, what are we doing about it, right? There's an opportunity there that I would love to see our next leadership see that as okay, this is a crisis. We need to get on board. And then so there's a risk and an opportunity when you have this much changeover. The risk is that institutional knowledge, the people who have been through this for the last 6 years, who have seen where our housing investments have been made, who have seen where we've talked about things like Act 250 and wastewater and wetlands, and can bring start us off running when we get back into the session. But the more we have new people, the opportunity of saying people with new ideas who don't have the institutional knowledge of saying, no, I don't want to try that. Oh, we tried that before. It didn't work. But who can bring those fresh ideas. But they also need a lot of training. So things move really slowly the first half of the first year of a biennium, and sometimes more, depending on how much training legislators need. If you're a freshman legislator and you are put on the housing committee, you've got to learn pretty quickly who are all of the players in housing in Vermont. What are all the current rules and regulations? I got to hear from the commissioner of housing. I've got to hear from groups like the chamber and the realtors, and from all of the nonprofit community, from VHFA. I've got to hear from everybody. And then I got to figure out, like, all right, who does what? Who am I going to be working with closely? And then when policy is brought up, to try and understand, okay, how does this fit in with the framework we already have? It's a lot. So both continuing with people who've been there before has its advantages and disadvantages. New people has advantages and disadvantages. One thing I will say is there was no supermajority in the last biennium. That meant no party had the ability to just automatically override a veto because of the number of people in the party that they had. And that forced more compromise and conversation. I don't care which party is in power, a supermajority makes it challenging to find compromise and slow down legislation in a way to say, okay, does this actually make sense? What do people think about this? Not just the advocates when we said this was in our top 3 things we want to do.
Do you think that, because I think the last election cycle 2 years ago, that was the first time in a while we didn't have a supermajority. And again, either direction, I've heard this. Right. Are you concerned about that?
Yeah, I'm really unsure what is going to happen. I think there's a lot of challenges with our federal administration. Will that influence how people vote in our local and state elections? It didn't 2 years ago. I think people still were looking at what are the challenges in my state and what are the people who are representing me doing about them, and voted in a way that represented that versus I don't like what's happening federally, so that's just going to be my full down ticket vote. But we'll see how that plays out. I think there's a lot of attention, right? Like when you lose the supermajority in both the House and the Senate, you're going to be really focused the next election to try and change that. And so there might be more work that's happening this year than happened 2 years ago. But I think as long as people are really talking about the issues, and again, regardless of the party, are they seeing the challenges that Vermonters are facing and coming up with policy solutions that aren't bumper stickers, right? I hate when I see candidates that are just like, we need affordable housing. What does that mean? It just means more Vermonters need affordable housing. Okay, but I need to know, what does that mean to you? And what are you thinking of doing to address that? And if you have nothing to back that up, I don't have a lot of time for that. We have serious problems, and if you can't acknowledge that they're complicated.
The more I have these conversations and the more you dial in, it doesn't seem, right? I keep saying, okay, we know the root cause, but there's not one magic fix.
And you pull one string and something somewhere else comes out. And that we saw that with that wastewater bill, that it wasn't just saying the state will have full control over wastewater hookups, or municipalities will have full control over wastewater hookups, because there are some municipalities that have the capacity to do that and some that don't. And the ones that have the capacity saying, these are our hookups, we're going to control it. We don't need you, state, to come in and check our work. We got this. And some municipalities are saying, we do not have the capacity for this. We need you to do it. Makes it really complicated to come up with a policy solution for that. So these are all complicated problems, and we need people who understand that and are willing to roll up their sleeves and dig in.
So you said the speaker pro tem and then the chairs of committees. Then you have the governor's office, and then obviously we have our state senators and congressmen. How is the politics trickling down into the decisions that we're making?
Yeah, the politics play a role, right? If the party has a platform, it can be challenging for individual legislators to say, yeah, but what are we doing about this? And that's where we saw the caucus for the Vermont economy that started last year come up, is rank and file bipartisanship of saying, our parties aren't focused on the things that we are hearing from our constituents about the regulation, about how challenging affordability is. They created the Caucus for Vermont's Economy to say, we have to talk about the economy. And we're going to create a caucus to do that because we don't feel like we have any other outlet for that.
And that's bipartisan.
That is bipartisan. It's led by House members from both parties. And we were really excited to see that, to say, okay, let's get away from sort of whatever national or statewide platform is that's being decided by party leaders and not by the people your constituents who are hearing from you, and saying they brought people in, everyday Vermonters, to say, what's your experience been with regulation? And the stories were really challenging for them to hear, but really important. And they weren't hearing those stories in their committee.
Do you see different, because I see it, different voices from rural versus metropolitan constituents in terms of direction of where we should go?
I think I am. Part of what we saw last year with the push against Act 181 is there are some people who classify that as that was a housing movement. Mm-hmm. And when I look at that, it was not a housing movement. I think it was good, potentially, for challenges that we were seeing come up from the implementation of 181 and what they would pose to housing. But that was really a property rights movement, saying, this is my property. Mm-hmm. You as the state cannot put these decisions on that are going to devalue it or tell me what I can and can't do on my property. I am the steward of my land. That was a property rights movement, not necessarily, I want to build housing and this is going to stop me from building housing. A lot of people have owned that land for 100 years. They've never built housing on it before. They probably aren't going to be building much housing on it in the future. I think we have to be a little bit careful of saying in Chittenden County, saying, look, that was a housing movement. I think in a lot of rural Vermont, they recognize they have serious housing challenges. They can be different than the housing challenges we have in Chittenden County, but it's not necessarily saying they're having the same sort of housing movement or priorities that are happening here. It's so discouraging when you're living your life and you feel like the state isn't going in the right direction. My municipality isn't going in the right direction. And part of it is, and it can be frustrating, right? You send a letter to your legislator. They never respond. Yeah. Ugh. It's like, then what's the point? Do it anyways, because there are those who are still reading them, even if they don't respond. But it's really important to be sharing what your experience is, to become engaged in ways, whether it's directly with your legislators or with an organization like the Realtors Association and the work that Peter and Kyle are doing there on advocacy work with the Vermont Chamber's advocacy work. I put my cell phone number out there because I want people to call me and say, what's going on with this bill? And tell me what they think about that bill. That helps our work immensely when we are hearing directly from people, and it helps legislators as well. As frustrating as it can be, and as much time as people are spending on work, kids, I know it's all encompassing, but taking that time to have those conversations is really important, and doing it at the state level and also doing it at the local level, right? I got that email saying, what are you doing in Jericho? What are you doing in your neighborhood that says no ADUs are allowed to be built? So glad you're talking on the state level, but what are you actually doing in your life to better these positions that you're talking about? I like that call to action. Okay, here we go. I'm working on joining our housing committee in Jericho, and I'm really digging into what am I doing to actually change this in a way that I can outside of just the state house. So I would say, don't get hopeless, get engaged.
I like that because, I've referred to Kevin a couple times, when he's looking forward to 2035 and saying, really, we need to grow. The data says, it's not an opinion, that for Vermont to become a more viable state and rank better in all these economic brackets, we need to grow. We need to have 800,000 people here instead of 650, which requires both jobs and housing. And if I had to guess right now, I'd say after this year, when they do the data again, I feel like we've gone back the other direction.
We're losing ground.
Maybe it's the fact that it's so connected to real estate and movement in and out. I think it's kind of going backward. But I'm curious to see what the data is going to bring. How much, if you're writing your legislators and you're talking to them, what would be the question then that you would ask them?
I don't even know if it's a question or it's that real clear example. If you're in real estate and you're saying, this is a barrier, water connection duplication is costing time and money. Can you solve this? If you're a plumber and you're saying, this regulation on workforce is making it really hard for me to bring up that next generation, for me to hire people in this, for people to get trained in this. This regulation I'm running into, because you can say it's impossible. But what that legislator needs is the specific, okay, how do I write a bill that's going to address this problem? And so when you're looking at engaging with legislators, these are part-time, right? They're not professionals. They don't have any staff. And I think for most Vermonters, they're like, they shouldn't have staff. In every other state, legislators have a swath of staff who are helping them with policy, who are doing the community engagement so they can draft policy. We don't have that in Vermont. So people rely on really specific constituent engagement and organizations like the Realtors Association, like the Chamber, to say, this is what we're hearing from. And we've actually moved into a much more proactive stance in our organization. Instead of just reacting to the policy that comes out, we have our Solution Summit conference in September. And there we'll have a policy roundtable where we're going to invite 20 legislators to come and sit in roundtables on specific issues like housing, workforce, economic development, healthcare.
Okay.
And they'll sit with businesses who are in attendance and say, okay, what are the problems? More focus, what are the solutions that you see? And from September, we'll take that to more individualized policy roundtables. And then we'll take that into the legislative session with hopefully some good ideas that are backed by people who support them and legislators who are willing to champion that policy idea. And I think that engagement is really important ahead of the session, because an idea that comes up in January is really hard.
Yeah, it reminds me, I had one of my friends who was a senator said, they were like, I went into the session or started and so enthusiastic and I was like, I'm gonna change all this stuff. And they were surprised by kind of like how the clunky it was to get stuff done and how you think you can do this, you can't, and all that. But there's a chance this year, right? Because we have a lot of movement, a lot of change, that things could speed up.
Yeah,
Maybe.
It depends.
Okay.
We'll see how long that training process goes when you have new legislators, how long it takes to get people to understand the process, to understand the players, to understand what's already in law. Sometimes I think we don't necessarily need to pass new laws. We need to better understand what's in place and then adjust, right? I testified on a bill last year where it was like, you don't need this. You already do things like this. You already have something in place that does this. That was time they could have spent on something else.
As getting to the end, one of the things is, so you're doing a lot. You are advocating, coming up with ideas, looking for solutions, staying hopeful. What keeps you going, right? Because I think sometimes when you're connected to this data and you look at it, it almost feels depressing. And I love Vermont. It's a beautiful place. I come back, I'm like, great, mountains, space, I'm home. So what keeps you doing this? What keeps you motivated to get up? And I got some battles to face today. I have some arguments to have, some tough news to deliver. What keeps you hopeful and motivated for how things can turn around?
I think during the session, in the thick of it, especially towards the end, it can be like, oh my gosh, this is so dysfunctional. My husband can always tell if it's mid-April because I'll be like, I'm looking at houses in Kentucky. We're not moving to Kentucky. It must be mid-April. You've reached your level of frustration.
That's weather related.
I think it's both. It's weather related and insane. I just can't, the insanity. And then the session ends. And then I get time to go out and talk with our members and hear their stories and meet their employees and hear their stories and go hiking and go paddleboarding and get into that Vermont that I love and that we all love and say, this is worth fighting for. I want my kids to have this. I want them to thrive and succeed here. I want my schools to thrive and succeed. I want my community to thrive and succeed. And getting those sort of inputs from the people that believe in the work that we're doing is what drives me. I love seeing the businesses that are growing here and meeting with entrepreneurs who are doing that work. And it really keeps me going during the session. It is a wonderful place. And like Kevin says, data is not destiny. We can change the direction that we're going in to create economic momentum and be a place that is both an environmental steward and an economic steward.
Appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for
and
having
speaking
me.
about it. And hopefully, like mid-session, maybe you can come back
Yeah.
and let me know the things we should be looking for.
You might have to play that part back to me at that point in time. Don't move to Kentucky, Megan.
All right. Or at least call me.
Yeah.
Okay. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Thank you.